So chapter 12 has to do with personality, where it comes from, how we measure it, and all the different theories having to do with that. Personality is defined as all the different unique traits that make us who we are and that are consistent across different situations, right? In general, we all act the same way across different kinds of situations, right? So it's based on consistency, right? You have stable behavior over time, and distinctiveness, right? That we all have different personalities. We may share some traits that we have in common, but everyone's personality is unique to them, right? So your personality is made up of many traits, right? So a personality trait is that stable factor of yourself over time. So there's theories that we have certain core traits that other traits will stem from, right? So if someone's core trait is being shy, then stemming from that trait is maybe nervousness, anxiety, right? That they're quiet, right? So that core trait has other traits that stem from it, okay? So the way that they've tried to figure out what these core traits are is through factor analysis. So in factor analysis, you get all the variables and you start making connections between them, right? You find the relationships between the variables, and the variables that have the most connections, right, are most likely to be the core traits, right? If you only have one trait that's connected to one other trait, it's not very likely that that's a core trait, right? Now, Raymond Cattell used the factor analysis method to try to find out what the core traits were, and he came up with 16 personality traits. So these are on page 510 if you would like to see what they are, but you don't have to have them memorized. Robert McCraw and Paul Costa came up with the 5-factor model. So they narrowed it down even further and claimed that everyone has 5 core traits, right? The big 5: extroversion, neuroticism, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, which spell out ocean, okay? So extroversion is sometimes also called positive emotionality, right? These are all the quote-unquote good traits, right? Being outgoing, social, friendly, assertive. So if you're low in extroversion, then you're more of an introvert, right? You're not very social, right? You're not very assertive. You're more quiet, into yourself, okay? So neuroticism is sometimes called negative emotionality. So these are kind of like the negative traits. So high in anxiety, very self-conscious, hostile and defensive, right? They tend to overreact to stress. They don't deal well with stress. So that's if you're high in neuroticism. If you're low in neuroticism, you're a little bit more confident, right? You're more calm in emergencies or in stressful situations. Openness to experience is when you're high in that, you are very curious, flexible, you have a good imagination, you might be seen as like quirky. So that's what they mean by like an unconventional attitude. It's outside of the norm. This also influences people's political ideologies and attitudes, right? Whether they're more traditional, right? So if you're low in openness to experience, you're more traditional, more conservative. If you're high in openness to experience, you tend to be more liberal or independent, right? So that's not always 100% the case, but that is a correlation that they have seen with openness to experience. Now, agreeableness, if you're high in agreeableness, you're very trusting, you work well with others, you're straightforward, you're empathetic, you're not confrontational, right? You're less likely to argue. And those with low agreeableness tend to be suspicious, aggressive, right? Easy to argue with. Now, conscientiousness is kind of like responsibility, right? So if you're high in conscientiousness, you're very disciplined, you're on time, you're organized, you're less likely to procrastinate, you're able to regulate yourself. So you have a lot of self-control, right? Where someone who is low in conscientiousness is very unorganized, impulsive, they're usually late, you can't really rely on them, okay? So what they've seen is that there are correlations between the big 5 traits, certain big 5 traits, and someone's socioeconomic status. Now, what they're not sure of is if it is a causal relationship. Does having certain traits cause these situations, right? So they have influences on major life outcomes. So like, for example, in career development, people who hold management positions, CEOs, right, high-paying positions tend to be extroverted, right, and agreeable. They tend to be high in these traits because they work well with others, they're very sociable, very friendly, right? In terms of health, people with low neuroticism tend to be healthier because they have less anxiety, less stress. If you remember from our disorders chapter, stress causes a lot of bad things, okay? And then relationships, right? If you're high in agreeableness, extroversion, again, right? You tend to have better relationships with others, both platonic and romantic, okay? And with conscientiousness, right? People who are high in conscientiousness tend to do very well in school because they're very organized. Again, they don't procrastinate, right? They make sure they get their stuff done. So those are the correlations that they have seen. But again, we're not sure if it's because they have these traits that they then, are put in those positions, or if being in those positions helps bring out certain traits. One of the best ways to measure personality is through self-report inventories, basically a survey or a questionnaire given to someone where they agree or disagree with certain statements or say what they're more or less likely to do, right? Because you know yourself best, right? You're really the only person that can tell a scientist, right, or someone else about yourself, right? So there's 3 different types. The first one is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. So this test is used really to help diagnose someone with a disorder, not necessarily to just measure their personality, right? So in this test, they measure 10 personality traits that are correlated with certain disorders. Now, what they've done is they've given this test to people who have been not like proven, but diagnosed with disorders, right? So they give them these tests so that they see how they answer certain questions. So this creates these score profiles, right? So if someone with depression, right, takes the exam and they answer questions in a certain way, right, in a certain pattern. If you give the test to someone and they are answering questions similarly to that person who was depressed, it indicates that that person is possibly also depressed, right? So it's not that you're scoring high or low for certain traits, but if you answer in a certain pattern, in a certain profile, it just makes it easier to diagnose if you have a disorder or not. So this isn't something that can stand alone. Just because you score a certain way doesn't guarantee that you have a disorder, but it can help in diagnosing it. Now, the 16 personality test that was made by Cartel, right, with the 16 source traits, it's also called the Myers-Briggs test, and it measures your personality through 4 different categories: introversion versus extroversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and judging versus perceiving, right? So your results will come out with 4 letters, right? So mine is, I think it's ISFP. I'm the defender, right? And usually defenders end up becoming teachers, so there you go. It's pretty accurate. But it's a very interesting test, as you guys saw, right, in the activity that we did. There's different personalities, right, and so you get a different combination of these letters depending on how you answer certain questions, right? So the NEO personality inventory was made by Costa and McRae to measure the big 5 traits. So this covers emotional, interpersonal, experiential, attitudinal, and motivational styles, right? All the things that are going to help identify whether you're high or low in the 5 traits. So the good and the bad of using questionnaires, right? So questionnaires, the good things are that they can be more objective since you are just collecting a bunch of data from a bunch of different people and then comparing it against itself, right? You're just comparing data. Now, the cons are that deliberate deception, right? People in general, right, can lie on the questionnaires. You have no way of knowing if they're telling the truth. And then some people will lie on purpose because they want to have a certain trait. Because there are some questions that are very obvious where you know what, if you pick a certain answer, it's going to give you a certain result. For example, on like a BuzzFeed quiz, if they ask you on a Saturday night, would you rather stay in and read a book, or would you rather go out to a club with 20 of your closest friends, right? If you pick the book one, you know they're going to say, oh, you're more of an introvert. If you pick the club one, they're going to say, oh, you're more of an extrovert, right? So you know exactly what's going to happen when you pick one of the answers. So people will then deliberately pick answers that go against what they would actually do because they want a specific response, right? So they'll fake a trait. Now, social desirability is similar, but it's something that doesn't necessarily happen on purpose, right? So if they give a certain situation where you know there's like the right thing to do that you should do if you want to be a nice person, some of us might pick that response even though in reality we might not actually do that, right? But because we want to be seen as socially desirable, right? We want to be seen as a good person. So we may pick answers that make us feel better because we're like, yeah, I would totally be a nice person in that situation. When, you know what? Some of us probably wouldn't. And that's just how we are. And now the last one is response sets. So some people will just agree or disagree with literally every statement, right? They don't really, maybe not pay attention to the test, but like they're just kind of like, yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense, that makes sense. Or like, no, I don't agree with any of this, right? So they don't actually have a personality. They just agree or disagree with absolutely everything. And so of course, all these different cons are going to skew your results. So you can really only take the questionnaires at a certain level of legitimacy, right? They're only valid up to a certain point. But again, it is really one of the best ways to measure personality, especially if people are being honest. So projective tests are the other way that we can measure personality. So in a projective test, a participant is shown an ambiguous image, right, or a stimulus that they then project their thoughts and feelings onto. Right, so the most common ones are the Rorschach ink blots and the thematic apperception test. Okay, because the stimulus that they're looking at is neutral and ambiguous, right, it allows people to kind of see what they feel, see what they think, right, and it supposedly uncovers, right, your unconscious and internal thoughts and feelings. So this test falls heavily under the psychoanalytic perspective, right, trying to uncover the unconscious and things like that. So the good thing about projective tests is that you can't really tell what's being measured as a participant, right? It's a neutral image, right? There's no clear answer, right? So you have to kind of say what you're thinking, say what you're feeling, okay? So it can reveal some things that you may not realize. However, there's a lot of cons, right? It's very low in reliability, right? You don't get the same results across the board because everyone's going to see something different, perceive something different, interpret something differently, right? So you don't really have a set of responses that you can kind of then compare against. Now, the scoring is also inconsistent because then the test administrator has to interpret what the participant is saying, and that is very subjective, right? The test administrator might perceive something as being negative versus another test administrator might see it as neutral or positive. Okay, so it's very subjective in terms of scoring, and a cultural bias is going to affect both the participant and the interpretation, right? The participant may see something because of something in their past, something in their culture that someone else from a different culture wouldn't notice. And then there's inadequate testing norms, right? These tests are usually administered in a therapist office, not really in like a lab setting, so it's hard to have a consistent way of testing when it's done differently every single time. So here on the slide, you can see on the left a Rorschach ink blot, and on the right is a picture from a thematic apperception test. So both of these are ambiguous images, right? The ink blot is just ink, right? But the shapes can make you see things, associate things, right? So you project your thoughts and feelings, your interpretations onto the ink blots, and you describe the shapes that you're seeing, the feelings that you get when you're looking at it, right? And different people are going to see different things, as we saw in our class discussion, right? On the right, the thematic apperception test image is a very neutral general image. So the point of the test is for the participant to come up with a story, right, in the picture. So based on the story that that person comes up with, you can then kind of interpret how they're feeling. So for example, someone with high anxiety would probably see this as the woman, you know, running the experiment with the beakers, right, holding the little pipette. You know, maybe she's a student, she's trying to get her PhD, right, she really needs this experiment to go well, she's under a lot of pressure, her teacher's there hovering over her, right, so if she doesn't do well, she won't get her PhD, right. So based on that story, you can tell that that person is very anxious, right, they're a very worried person because the story that they came up with was one that was filled with anxiety. Right, so again, very subjective. Everyone's going to come up with something different. It's hard to standardize answers because not all answers are similar or have any similarities. But it is interesting to see then what people are thinking in that moment.